introduce our next panel on e-mobility, we have Jacob Ward.
All right, good morning, everyone. You are in for a treat. Our next panel is on electric mobility and supporting infrastructure, and we have an amazing slate of speakers pulled together for you. I am happy to introduce them. My name is Jacob Ward. I am a PhD candidate here at CMU. I also have an appointment with the U.S. Department of Energy's Vehicle Technologies Office, and so have the good fortune of working with most of these people in both capacities. Our moderator for the next panel is also from Carnegie Mellon University. Costa Samaras is an associate professor here in civil and environmental engineering and engineering and public policy. Fortunate to have him to guide the next session. We also have, let's go from, your left to right. We have Carly Dobbins-Bucklad from Ford Smart Mobility, LLC, where she is the Mobility Solutions Strategy Lead. Carly is a native daughter of Carnegie Mellon University, has a degree from Heinz, so we welcome her back today, and very much look forward to her perspective as Mobility Solutions Strategy Lead, with former roles as Senior Policy Analyst for the Allegheny Conference on Community Development. And next to Carly, we have Stan Young. Stan Young is the Advanced Transportation and Urban Scientist at the National Renewable Energy Lab. We welcome him here to Pittsburgh from Golden, Colorado. Stan serves as the Advanced Transportation and Urban Scientist, where he leads the urban science pillar as part of the U.S. Department of Energy Smart Mobility Research Initiative. So we welcome Stan, too. Next to Stan, we have Sarah Olexsak, who is also a native daughter of Pittsburgh. She has boomeranged from a former role at the U.S. Department of Energy, so I'm fortunate to call her a former colleague. She's now here back in Pittsburgh at Duquesne Light, serving as the manager for transportation electrification. In that role, she works to build and implement the company's electric vehicle and charging infrastructure strategy. And formerly, she managed transportation projects that increase energy efficiency and reduce emissions through the convergence of connection, automation, shared mobility, and electrification, all timely topics for today, at the U.S. Department of Energy. Next to Sarah, we have Tiara Thurston, a general manager for Tesla. Tiara has spent the past few years at Tesla building consumer confidence in electric vehicles and home energy solutions. She is a stakeholder in charging infrastructure for Tesla's consumers and works closely with cities around the central United States, educating on current product offerings, consulting on fleet procurement, along with EV and energy infrastructure. Please welcome the panel.
Well, welcome everybody to our panel on e-mobility and the future of electric and automated transportation and beyond. We're really grateful that all of you have decided to spend some time with us today. We're grateful to Energy Week and to Anna Siefken and Amanda King and the staff here at the Wilton E. Scott Institute for Energy Innovation for putting on such an amazing Energy Week once again this year. What we're going to talk about today is a free-flowing dialogue around the future, right? That's an easy thing that we can do because we're not going to be wrong until we leave this area. We want to understand what are the biggest technology and policy and business trends in electric and automated mobility, as well as connected communities, so that we can help inform you all as entrepreneurs, as policy leaders, and as other community stakeholders. So I wanted to start with Tiara from Tesla. And we work in electric vehicles here at Carnegie Mellon. We know about electric mobility, but maybe the general public doesn't have a broad understanding of why should they buy an EV. So maybe you're familiar with the sales angle. What are your salespeople doing in Tesla to get people into EVs?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. I think it's been really interesting over the last year to see the adoption rate really pick up with Model 3. And so the types of consumers that we've transformed into from early adopter phase has shifted pretty drastically. And so probably the biggest reasons we're seeing folks get into electric vehicles is, one, they're a lot of fun to drive. And so many times it's not necessarily around sustainable initiatives or cost savings. It's really about the safety of the vehicle first and foremost. And so I think with the first principle thinking that Elon uses when building these vehicles, we've been able to integrate a lot of safety features that aren't currently available in a gas combustion engine vehicle. Second thing is speed. A lot of our cars are fast, every car in fact, so we're 0 to 60 in our Model S now at 2.23 seconds, fastest production car in the world. And Even on the Model 3, it's at about 4 seconds. And so I think when you drive an EV for the first time, it absolutely changes your perspective. And then I really think the other thing is not going to a gas station any longer. And so convenience of charging at home, being able to be on the road, not having to plan around refueling your vehicle is a huge convenience feature, and I don't think our consumers quite realize how easy that is. There's still a lot of fear around range anxiety and where am I going to charge. In a Tesla specifically, it's all integrated into the navigation system, and so you can just say, navigate to Florida, and it's going to build out your entire trip. And so again, convenience.
Well, while the torque is amazing in electric vehicles and the acceleration is really fast, I just want to remind everybody, drive responsibly, stop at stop signs, pretty important. Carly, you're at Ford, so tell us about what's happening in smart mobility and what's Ford's vision for what we are going to deal with in the future of transportation?
Sure. Easy question. No,
Sure.
Small. So Ford, it's been around for over 100 years, and it's done that in part because the importance of mobility and movement for our societies to exist and for people to really be able to continue to progress. There's one of the mantras at Ford is the freedom of mobility for people drives human progress. And so the recognition at Ford and why they've created Ford Mobility is that the world is changing, right? Just like many other parts of our society, it's being disrupted. Transportation is being disrupted by rapid technology changes. And Ford wants to be a part of that future, of helping to shape it, but then also helping to deliver on the promise of mobility driving human progress. And so in the strategy group, a lot of what we work on is actually not just what those different pieces are. When we talk about connected, autonomous, shared, electric, and then I would add to that just the data AI layer that really makes it smart. But how are we going to realize the potential? How are we going to make this all work together so that the value is realized for the users as well as the cities, the places that can really benefit from this?
What's the landscape for beyond cars? And how is Ford thinking about that?
Ford is thinking about it a lot. So I would say there's actually a sort of a vehicles as as something that will continue in the future, but then a whole lot of attention on other form factors, whether that's micromobility like scooters. So Ford bought Spin, one of the scooter companies last year, to also just the need for services that help people be able to connect with what the other options are or connect between options. So that includes how do we enable sort of insights into our own transit systems that already exist today and make sure that they're in the core of many of the other offerings that could exist. That has to do with smart parking and curb space management. It has to do with analytics around where demand is now, but then where we expect it to be in the future and how we can all make sure the pieces line up there for that. But in terms of the specific new form factors, I cannot talk about those, but there are lots of interesting ideas in development.
So Stan, we've heard a little bit about beyond cars and how additional form factors and other micromobility might fit into the urban landscape. But, if we're going to be here in Energy Week 10 years from now, will total vehicle miles traveled in the United States be higher than today? Lower? Same? What do you think?
Well, if you take any evidence from the recent FHWA numbers, we set a record for vehicle miles traveled in 2018. Most likely, most projections, things I've seen, it will continue to increase, but we're hoping that the actual person miles traveled, the ability for people to access goods, services, and employment, the growth in that with new mobility as a service, with new forms, which we can't speak about, particularly in the urban areas, will shift more and more to these new, much more efficient forms of transportation.
How does that fit with a kind of suburban and exurban and rural transportation? How are the needs of those passengers going to get served in this new mobility environment?
I usually use the term urban to mean metropolitan, this whole business of understanding how cities operate, how cities thrive, how cities is an organism, and that encompasses all its suburban and exurban. What we addressed in the 40s with the interstate highway system was really intercity farm to market, and it spurred our economy tremendously. Now our friction in the system is intracity, and how do we address that? moving that forward, I almost forgot your question here. How does that all work? We're really connecting these nodes of people to what they want to get connected with. And how do we
I kind of like the beatboxing.
Yeah, there we go.
Sounds like we.
Is this working? There
Yeah,
we
we're
go.
good now.
There we go. How is that going to work? We have this, one of the things we're working on. Can I talk about these automated mobility districts?
Yeah.
Okay, if you look at cities, what really enabled the efficiencies at the turn of the century? It was the elevator. We got density, we got high rises, and if you look at the building efficiencies, they went up. We got on this concept of automated mobility districts somewhat spurred by these automated electric shuttles that are out there, but there's a whole history of it. I've interacted a lot with universities, and you don't see any cars driving around CMU. And these large land-grant universities, you still see it. And if they could outlaw cars overnight, they would. Once we have a solution that interlinks enclaves of buildings efficiently, so you can just either drop your automobile off at the periphery or use mobility as a service or use mass transit or anything else like that, it's going to start changing the urban and suburban dynamic. I mean, the most attractive places you want to be are not cluttered with automobiles. Think of amusement parks, serene universities, or anything like that. And once, whether it's automated electric shuttles or what Ford has in its development labs, the thing that solves that problem and starts us to be able to create, attractive automated mobility zones or districts, it'll start the nucleus of what I think will be where cities will be progressing in the future.
And so, Carly, will these new mobility services of the future be half electric, all electric, some other fuel?
I think the general idea is that electric is where it's all going to go. In part because, batteries allow for smaller form factors. The idea of, it's not one size fits all. It's the right size at the right time. So we need to be able to have those deployed. You need to be able to scale and fluctuate based on what they are. So electric is really the thing that lets you have that kind of flexibility. Combustion engines just can only get so small and be effective.
All right, well, so a while ago we did, a backlight envelope calculation, which we like to do here at CMU. And we said if everybody in the country were to drive an electric vehicle next year, and the same amount of miles happen, then we would need another 25% electricity generation, right? And 25% additional electricity generation over the long term is not that big of a deal, but there are still plenty of folks who are really worried about near-term impacts on the electricity grid. So we're lucky to have Sarah here from our local utility to let us and educate us on what are the impacts of EVs on a local utility grid, and will we still be able to turn the lights on if everybody's driving Tesla?
Just only if they're not only Teslas.
Okay.
No. So I'm going to answer this from the perspective of the local Pittsburgh region. But there are a lot of things that are going to apply across the country as utilities are working to plan for more electric vehicles on their grid. So something maybe a little more unique to Pittsburgh that I learned when I got here and started working for Duquesne Light is that one of the more positive consequences of the deindustrialization of Pittsburgh is that we actually have a lot of excess capacity here. So generation is a separate thing, and of course we don't generate electricity at Duquesne Light, but what we're looking at is we have plenty of capacity. The thing that was brought up in our first panel today was clustering and management of our existing grid. So the idea is not that we have a problem with total capacity, but when we're seeing lots of electric vehicles in certain neighborhoods, all coming home at roughly around the same time, plugging in their electric vehicles, this is something that we want to watch and learn from. So right now in our service territory, we've seen a 35% year-on-year increase for EV adoption. That said, it is still less than 1% of new vehicle sales. But by 2025, we project, the Electric Power Research Institute, I should say, projects that that number is going to look more like 6% of new vehicles sold in 2025 will be electric. And then 10% of electric vehicles sold by 2030, and so on from there. So that's why it's really important that utilities are getting engaged at the stage of the market right now and beginning to work with customers and plan ahead for the future. So you're seeing a lot of electric utilities, and I'll probably talk a little bit more about it later, work on pilot projects where we're collecting data and starting to work more closely with our customers as they deploy charging stations so that we can plan our grid in the most efficient and resilient way possible. And I'm continue to be increasingly impressed by our transmission planners, getting to start to work with them. They're a brilliant group of people, and I know that they're up for this challenge and this opportunity.
Great. So we're lucky to have Alex Pazuchanix from the city of Pittsburgh here. And I know that the city of Pittsburgh has really been out front in a lot of these issues on mobility and sustainability. But I wonder if Alex can tell us about, how does electrification and smart mobility fit into what the city's plans are for the future?
Sure. So we're a relatively recent department. The newest in the city is the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. And a lot of our goal or our vision is our ability to kind of use physical mobility as a way to promote economic and social mobility. So I think, first and foremost, it's important for us. What constitutes success is that if every vehicle in the city of Pittsburgh, overnight became an electric vehicle, that wouldn't necessarily solve the mobility challenges that we address. We would not necessarily consider it a success to just have a spectrum of single occupant vehicles that are electric as opposed to single occupant vehicles that are not. It's still the same challenges around parking, still the same challenges around land use. So I think we and a number of other cities are trying to think about electrification in the context of a broader suite of mobility options, mobility platforms. I pedaled very quickly on my electric bicycle in order to be only a few minutes late to the panel today. I think the conversation around scooters is obviously really important as well, ditto with shuttles. But I also think to Carly's point about whether this system will be electric, half electric, all electric, not electric at all, some of that is market decisions and market choices and market signals. Some of it is also policy, regulation, structure on the public side to be able to articulate, our values, our principles around reducing local source emissions. A number of cities have sort of articulated as their goals, as their priorities, particularly as autonomous vehicles develop. But in general, that we use levers at our disposal, whether pricing, whether curb availability, to kind of create incentives on the public side to promote electric adoption of multiple modes, not just single occupant vehicle travel.
Yeah. And that's why I think Ford and others have recognized it's so important to partner with cities in figuring out what these solutions of the future should be, because what good does it do to come up with something that then either doesn't meet the needs of society or is banned by society, right? Like we need these things to come together and really converge in a useful way. And one of the biggest barriers, and I know Sarah talked about this in the past, is to seeing the electrification in the transportation sector is that flip side. It's not necessarily the vehicles themselves, it's the infrastructure in place to be able to really have them be omnipresent and parked where you need them or picked up where you need them or charged at the right times and be able to manage this whole new piece that we haven't previously had to have baked into how we built our infrastructure.
Well, and I think that kind of question of intergenerational infrastructure is really important, right? We in the city are often making investments, 20, 30 years. I hope the Greenfield Bridge lasts a lot longer than that. We are making physical infrastructure investments and network infrastructure investments as well that will, outlast me, outlast sort of our generation. And we in government are historically very bad at managing technology risk, right? In knowing, what the right investment that enables the most potential futures is going to look like. And so I think that there's a real, concern about large-scale deployment on the public side of that infrastructure because we don't want to back the Betamax, right? We want to make sure that we are creating a system that's adaptable and future-proof. rather than kind of getting stuck with the government standard.
So maybe Sarah and Tiara can talk about the interplay between electric vehicles and home energy storage and how distributed assets between utilities and companies, what that landscape looks like and how it might fit into the larger kind of urban energy system.
Yeah, I think this is a really exciting space that we're working in right now with we acquired Solar City a couple years ago, and we've been able to bring home energy storage to residents and individual consumers. And I think as we move forward, I really see the responsibility of some of the challenges going to those direct consumers by being able to really understand your energy consumption at your home level through a phone app and being able to control when you're charging your vehicle. We have programs within the vehicles where we can set our charge times for 2 a.m. In the morning, not at 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. when we see surges. I think the other really exciting space that we're entering into and been working very close with the city of Pittsburgh here specifically is how do you build that additional infrastructure through battery storage at a commercial scale. And we've been able to deploy a number of commercial level scales throughout the world, and I think that's the next phase of what's really to come. Really exciting.
Yeah, I'll just add that Duquesne Light, like a lot of electric utilities, are really changing a lot about how we do business, and that we're becoming very customer focused. Understanding what our customer needs are in the energy space is something that utilities may not have paid as much attention to in the past. But there's a lot of really exciting things happening here, and I think that, interestingly, electric vehicles, transportation electrification, is allowing utilities to kind of take this topic along with a variety of others and say, how can we begin to serve our customers in a new and beneficial way for both parties? So there's a lot of excitement and innovation, I think, happening around that.
So I run my dishwasher overnight, Sarah, just because I wanted to benefit Duquesne Light. But Tiara said that she could program a Tesla to charge at 2 a.m. When would it be the best, and best I'm using kind of with air quotes, for Duquesne Light to have Tesla charge, or EVs charge?
Yeah. Well, I think that we want to balance. We want our customers to see electric vehicles as convenient for their lifestyles, convenient for their needs. So I would say that probably right now is something that's very important. And I think as time evolves here, Duquesne Light will be looking for opportunities to say, how can we make our grid the most efficient possible, and how can we potentially offer incentives or unique rates that could address these types of things. These are things that we're looking forward to gathering a lot of data about in an upcoming pilot, and also really importantly, continuing to get input from our customers about what they want and what they're looking for to make their lives convenient.
Hey, go ahead, Carly.
And let's make it kick to stand. But I mean, it also has to do with where are we getting our energy from, right? And if we do see an increased adoption of solar, let's say, and that shines in the middle of the day, it might make a lot more sense to charge more of our vehicles of whatever form factor at that same time, because we'd be matching sort of supply and demand. And so that's exciting. This is how all these things start to stack up together, but why we need that systems view, right, in order to realize the potential.
So Stan, can vehicles, and also Sarah, can vehicles and chargers be demand response assets?
Absolutely. If you bring this topic up at my lab, you'll get a crowd around you of very rabid supporters of this. It's two ways. First, if you have a significant portion of your fleet battery storage and have the smarts to leverage it with your grid, you can maximally leverage the renewable energy. We don't have control of when renewable energy is available. It's when the sun shines, when the wind blows, when the waves are high, you name it. And having the ability to control, or at least on the demand side, turn the knob up and down of when we charge these vehicles, is an incredible asset. Both the electric companies are talking with the auto manufacturers, are talking with the grid suppliers of how do we build out the next generation of grids and microgrids to fully leverage this. It kind of gets into the decentralization. How do we build districts? How do we build, right now we're putting solar on individual rooftops according to where they face in the sun. Can we begin to group together whole communities and put the solar assets where they need to be and fully leverage the local generation as efficiently as possible before we have to draw off the grid?
You want to jump in there, Sarah?
Yeah, so in 2018, Duquesne Light was the first electric utility in Pennsylvania to propose to our regulators an EV pilot. So we're really excited. We received approval for a pilot program in December of 2018, and right now we are rolling out the various aspects of this program. So the one that is most relevant here is that we are incentivizing level 2 charging stations for commercial customers. And for the next 5 years, charging stations that are incentivized or part of this project will be feeding us data, and we will be working with these customers that are part of this program. Hi, Mike. There is working on it from ChargePoint, and so we're going to be getting a lot of data and the opportunity in the future to think about how we might be able to use these banks of charging stations that are part of this project. These are the types of things that we're studying.
Fantastic. I think, Stan, you made a really good point about demand response and the ability for the vehicle to be an asset as a one-way asset is valuable in its own right. I think we had heard a lot and talked a lot about vehicle to grid and providing the battery, providing some ancillary services back to the grid. But the points that you all are making here is that even if we can just switch the charger on and off, that in itself kind of gives us a whole new level of functionality. Is that what you and Carly were kind of alluding to? Yeah.
Absolutely. There's been a lot of theoretical work on the two-way, but to be honest, the two-way has more business challenges than about anything else. But just having that one way, only charge my car when there's sufficient power bandwidth on my local transformer or something like that would bring tremendous benefits both on the infrastructure side, both leveraging renewables, as well as bringing overall efficiency to the system.
And back to the connected piece of what we were all talking about. So one of the things Ford's been working on is an open vehicle to grid integration platform to share the data about electric cars and vehicles and where are they and when are they charging. But in part, you need that in order to be able to work on, to have these decisions be made and send the right signals. But also, how are we going to plan ahead for the future? Where do we need to invest in the infrastructure, right? If you can tell where demand is and where it seems to be growing, that's how we're going to get a sense of what next steps we have to take so we can figure out where to make those investments that are not the Betamax. So just trying to tie the pieces, right, of how all this stuff is really going to stick together.
And I think to that end, understanding where the market will be and where the market isn't, right? Because in part, I think our obligation is to make sure that the rollout and the deployment is equitable, is accessible in places that the market may not necessarily be fully, developed at this point or even sort of naturally developed. I think one of our priorities is to figure out how we can make sure that that distribution happens, again, with public resources as necessary in order to sort of promote the equity.
And that's great. And I want to come back to that point as we think about the larger communities, but I want to integrate another technology into our discussion. We've been alluding to connected vehicles. We've been alluding to micromobility and other form factors. We haven't really talked about driverless yet. And CMU being the birthplace of driverless, I wanted to talk about, every week we get new analyst reports that says, 1 million% of miles by 1997 are going to be electric and autonomous. Can maybe Tiara and the group can give us some real world insight of what really can we expect and how do we make some plans for that?
A little bit of controversy. Here we go.
Yeah.
No, I think the progress that we're making is fantastic. We've just unveiled a number of new features to the car, and they come through software updates. And so our entire fleet updated over, I think, the last 30 days with some new features related to summon. And so we're actually now being able to summon the vehicle out of its parking space. It's making turns. Elon's been very vocal about additional features coming to the car over the next 12 months related to the full self-driving project. And you can see a number of videos online with Model X specifically being able to travel. I think what's exciting and the features that come with enhanced autopilot specifically on long distance driving is the ability to reduce driver fatigue. The car is much safer. It's reading the vehicles that are coming into its peripheral. It's being able to react. It's doing automatic lane change at this point. We're doing navigate on autopilot, which is taking on and off ramps, which is pretty spectacular to experience. So if you haven't, I recommend this room specifically to do just that. And then as we continue on, we're expecting to see those features come live in inner city driving, which will, I'm sure, enhance the safety of not only the driver, but the citizens and the vehicles around that car as well. And so it's a really exciting time, and thank you to all of the contributors at CMU. We're a huge partner.
So Alex, your department just launched some principles around automated vehicles. Maybe walk us through what those are and why they were needed.
Sure. So I think one of the important elements and one of the unique challenges or opportunities in working in Pittsburgh is that there is a sense, or there is a vision of what the driverless future looks like at its completion, right? But there is also a reality around the fact that there is significant testing kind of continually undergoing, that vehicles are not, frankly, ready for true prime time, true automation at this point, and we exist in this kind of interim step, this interregnum at the moment around testing and operations. The Pittsburgh principles are an opportunity for us as the city, as residents of Pittsburgh, to attempt to interject kind of our values and our principles in the way that testing develops, because I think we believe that as the engineering and as the process is kind of underway, there are structures that are being built into the business processes. There are structures that are being built into kind of what the vehicle is expected to do, what the ADS is expected to do. I think most people, observers of the industry would feel that the kind of initial business cases around autonomous development are very likely to be, heavily urban areas with shared fleets providing some form of kind of shared mobility service. That's a tremendous opportunity, number one, because you're dealing with a smaller set of larger actors as opposed to kind of a plethora of options. But two, it's an opportunity to kind of inject our values in terms of the way that those vehicles operate, the way that they gain access to the curb, what a zero occupant vehicle trip should be priced at, what a single occupant vehicle trip should be priced at, and kind of up the spectrum. So I think we're really excited, number one, to kind of have as close of a collaborative relationship with both CMU and with the testing operators to kind of peek in there, and two, to make sure that we're kind of getting a word in edgewise in terms of representing the public value, public interest in accessibility, in equity, in operations. And I think a big one of those is the idea that these fleets, as they develop, should be with electrification in mind, that they are kind of reducing impact on the roadway wherever possible, both in terms of emissions and, frankly, in terms of weight and wear and tear on our infrastructure. So I think that there's a real opportunity in Pittsburgh specifically to kind of interject that.
So we know that automation can be a big help to reducing the public health crisis of 37,000 road fatalities in the United States every year. That's the equivalent of a jumbo jet crashing every few days, right? And so we kind of brush that aside, that that's the cost of doing business of travel, but that doesn't have to be, and automation can bend that safety curve. But maybe Carly and Stan can tell us about what's it going to do to energy use and emissions.
Sure. This is the whole reason the Department of Energy is in this. They've been in vehicles for decades, and for decades MPG ruled because our mobility was 95+% dominated by the personal automobile. The DOE came to the realization 5 years ago that with all the new technologies on the horizon, that foundation of vehicle-dominated travel may be beginning to shift. They put out a mantra, maximizing mobility while minimizing energy, and it really struck. Sarah, you may have been responsible for that. I don't know. All of our metrics up until now have been very either vehicle-centric related or infrastructure related. And when they put out that mantra, it kind of drove home, how do we get from miles per gallon to mobility per gallon? Particularly in the urban areas. The rural areas, I think, will be dominated by automobile traffic for a much longer time, just sheer distances. So we started along the path of how do we define that? And it went back to the table of how do we define mobility? How do we put metrics around it? I'll give my 30-second pitch here. We define mobility as the quality of a holistic network to connect people with the goods, services, and employment that define a high quality of life. It has a lot to do with accessibility theory and academics. We took that, we created a framework around it that included travel time, cost, and energy in that. And now I can turn to Alex and say, Alex, what's your mobility energy productivity score for your city, and how is it going to increase or decrease with these technologies? That's what we're focused on. We're understanding just because we put more miles on the network doesn't mean mobility is improved. And just because we shift to EVs, does it really mean we've improved quality of life? And that's where we're headed with understanding the dynamic, particularly in urban systems, meaning full metropolitan areas, of how that equation can be nudged with technology, be influenced with new business models, and trying to provide a guide saying, how do we improve the overall experience for all our citizens?
So I want to get Carly's thought, but I'm an academic and I really appreciate that nuanced and detailed answer. But I asked, will energy go up or down? And can you give me a up or down? You, Stan, yeah.
I'm going to directly quote the DOE on this one. They said, we could actually spend more energy in the transportation sectors if the corresponding benefit was greater than the energy we put in. So we are not concentrated on energy going up and down. We are very concerned that the energy is renewable and sustainable, but we're focused on the benefits of the energy in the transportation sector, and does it increase the productivity that we want for our.
Okay. Carly, what do you think about this whole space?
I do think that the source of the energy matters when we want to talk about impacts on a city. And Bill Ford has been pretty vocal in saying that, congestion does not contribute to quality of life. It is not freedom of mobility, and we want to have a hand in helping with that. But one way to do that is also with shared, increasing the shared aspect of the connected, autonomous, electric, and shared piece. And the idea is that electrification, connectivity, and autonomy, if we can have those things together, actually really helps with the case for making shared more convenient and more prevalent. You can have more of the different, micro-transit and micro-mobility in addition to transit, and sharing the vehicles in form factor now, which inherently means you get more benefit per unit of energy, right, in terms of transportation provided. And also it lets you use the assets you have more efficiently, lets you do more with them. So it's one of those things where maybe we're going to take a lot more trips or have a lot more movement, but hopefully either with energy that causes less negative impacts, or in a better, more efficient way using our assets.
So maybe to the whole group, I'm a social person. I like sharing. I like the notion of sharing for shared rides. But if you've ever shared a kind of an Uber or Lyft, it's not great, right? Like you're about to go to your hotel or whatever, and then it dings and it takes a left. You're like, I just want to go home.
That's right. There's a lot of room for improvement.
How much are you going to pay me for that sharing inconvenience? And do we think that sharing is going to be widespread enough to bend this? So Tiara's shaking her head.
It's going to depend.
All right.
And the cities have a role to play in that in terms of pricing, but I'll let Tara talk.
Yeah. I think what we're seeing right now is an advancement in subscription specifically. We've seen a lot of interest around this, a lot of interest around the rideshare space flipping over to EV. And so this is an active conversation we're having with the fleet procurement. I see it being more fully autonomous, and you being able to hail a Tesla or another EV through an application where there is no driver. And so it's not necessarily that we would be in a car with other people. I don't think that people want to do that necessarily. And so there will be individual user cars out there driving around driverless, making money for the owner. And then there will be also rideshare where you're just doing it through application. And I very much see it moving in that direction pretty quickly.
That's a private-focused ecosystem. Alex, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think one, the kind of ultimate sharing space kind of is the right of way, right? You know, the most natural form of sharing is the sidewalk, the fact that we have kind of public space and have the opportunity, frankly, to recapitalize on public space that is not being used for single occupant vehicle storage, but is instead being opened and made accessible to people. The second thing that I would say, and it's amazing that it's been a panel on 45 minutes and hasn't discussed kind of the logistics and freight at all, but I think a whole inverse of the equation is not how people get to jobs, opportunities, access to resources, but how those resources make their way to individuals, and I think that that's kind of a natural opportunity for the sharing economy as well, as we see kind of a dramatic increase in sort of distribution and all of the potentials in order to, or all the technology potentials in order to increase distribution. And then third, I think that pricing mechanism is important and is kind of the one sort of natural economic constant that, you know, people make decisions to in other cities to decide the pooled ride versus transit versus you know, an individual shared ride. People have different motivations and different ticks that, you know, whether they're valuing pricing or valuing time or convenience or access or various elements. The most important thing from the city perspective is to be able to provide enough information for people to make informed choices based on the things that matter to them.
I'm glad you mentioned freight because we at CMU just started a big project on energy efficiency of package delivery. And so we're looking at sidewalk droids and automated road vehicles and air drones. I got my drone pilot's license now, so everybody watch out. And so hopefully next year we'll be able to give you some results of what that project entails. But that really kind of opens up what the whole public realm looks like in a world of connected, automated, electric mobility. And maybe just quickly, can Sarah interject here, is we've now talked about this private ecosystem where people go home to their garages and they charge overnight and there's a structured rate and everybody has controlled charging. But now we're talking about kind of vehicles zipping all over the place all the time. So what does charging look like for kind of real-time, all-day charging? Is it going to be fast charging on the street corners? Or how does that even work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm kind of thinking about it from a couple of different angles. I do think that primarily right now, when we think about what we're planning for, it is more to what we've been talking about earlier. But I think that the key here is publicly accessible DC fast charging and having those in intra-urban hubs and also along corridors between different regions. But when it comes to having them in cities, something that's really exciting that is happening now is that DC fast charging is traditionally in the past been normal ones, not Tesla superchargers, but 50 kW. But now we are seeing most, if not all, installations of these DC fast chargers going in at 120 kW, 150 kW, the whole way up to 350 kW and beyond.
So
yeah.
just for the folks in the audience, 350 kilowatt is not a small, like unit, right? You can have a decent size industrial boiler that's size, right? So that I imagine would cause a little bit of a grid challenge if everybody turns on 350 kWs in the same neighborhood at the same time.
Yeah, and I don't think that everyone will have 350 kWs in the neighborhood at the same time, but to your original question, it's about locating these in places when we can look at the transportation data and say, where can we site these in a region where they're going to get the highest utilization, be used most efficiently, and then we work collaboratively with the different partners that are involved in this infrastructure build so that we're siting them in locations where we have capacity. And if we don't have capacity today, we really look at the costs and we say, how much is it going to take to update this and bring this electricity in? So I think for your answer, it's about, I do think that for those types of applications, the DC fast charging is going to be a great usage.
Carly, you were you wanted to jump in on the kind of the mobility ecosystem.
I mean, just generally all the time, but okay, yeah. I'm not sure on which specific element was so exciting. So I do think that when it comes to shared, it just goes back to the right size at a right time, but the idea that in places where you have less physical capacity to accommodate people, that's where, in theory, it will cost you more to travel in a non-shared format. And that part of what autonomy also brings in terms of shared also means just sharing vehicles. So you don't have to own it. You can have the right one come to you. And that whole piece of how we were talking about with the goods delivery as well, the fact that everyone does not have to go to things, that things come to them, will fundamentally shift our current patterns. And people are already grappling with what that might mean, because it's hard to necessarily anticipate human behavior at such a grand sort of disruption. But people think that, the goods delivery piece of autonomy, and then combined with electrification to allow for a variety of form factors and distances and time and convenience and all those things, everyone thinks it's going to be revolutionary. It's going to be disruptive at a massive, massive way. Your great grandkids are going to be like, "How did you do that? You went to the store and you got milk? What?" It's going to be crazy.
Well, I mean, we're working on a project on intelligent curbs and how that works for the future. And everywhere I go in kind of mobility circles, everybody is like yammering on about the curb. Like Stan and Alex and Carly, why should we care about the curb?
Go ahead, Tim.
The street is the ultimate, I think, Alex, you said that, the sharing space. When automobiles dominated, we created a curb, both for drainage as well as, hey, these automobiles not in use. And when the reports were coming out about Uber and Lyft creating congestion due to these drop-offs and pickups, something clicked. And I think Uber got out in front of it with this curb productivity index saying, hey guys, yes, we don't want to drop off in the middle of the streets. Could we get some curb space? And it started, I think it led to your project. We have a project in it. What is the most productive use of the curb space? How much should be giving over to parking versus food trucks versus goods delivery? And do we have the technology to put the policies in place and to manage it appropriately? And I think that's a sea change with respect to infrastructure and infrastructure management that we're just on the forefront of that's going to be good.
Alex, your thoughts, but just kind of give I'd like to weight my preferences towards food trucks if that's okay with you. So.
Fair enough. Well, and I think that we are at a unique nexus where the technology enables us to do some really amazing things on the behavioral side, right? Like prior to this point, 5 years ago, and frankly, in some communities, even around us, you've got a static meter where you literally feed a quarter in, you turn the dial, and that's the amount of time that you have, and it's a massive pain in the butt to change your signs, to change your pricing, all of those elements. Now through the ability to detect the utilization of the curb, to the ability to change pricing at a infinitesimally small increment of time. And also, I think, to create a unifying theory around curb access, pricing strategy around curb access, kind of regardless of the length of time. On the short end, we're working with Costa and others on, what is that minute, 2 minute increment of time that a double parked car creates, secondary externalities around congestion and inconvenience and everything else. With Sean, we've got another project on, what does a 6-month closure of that curb mean for, detours, for, pedestrian inconvenience. So I think we have not, as a city, the only increment of time that we've had to think about it was, the dollar that we charge for an hour of parking. Now we're able, through technology, to work on both ends of the spectrum to say there's a unifying narrative about how much access to this should charge. And once we have that access, or once we have that narrative, then we're able to inject our values, our priorities, and say these things are more important than others, regardless of whether or not they are the most cost-effective use of the curb. They are the most public value for the curb.
Okay. We're starting to get some great audience questions, so I'm going to start peppering some of those with our last few minutes. One of the ones that I wanted to address to Harley and Tiara is, can an autonomous vehicle handle a Pittsburgh left? And so this is when, you basically take the right of way from somebody else illegally, I guess, and people drive more aggressively than robots. I guess let me academicize this question. How will autonomous vehicles and humans share the road together?
I'll just say that this is definitely a hot topic that is being worked on, right? Because everyone knows that we're not just going to jump ahead to full autonomy, right? There's going to be sharing of human drivers and autonomous drivers before we would ever get to something that was fully automized. Yeah. And so what that means is it's very important to plan for that exact thing. And generally speaking, we were talking about driving boats earlier backstage. Is this, you know how you have to there's a bunch of rules about who has to give way? Think about that being applied. So robots give way to humans would be the simple way I would put it. I'm not obviously on the AV team, so I can't give you a more specific answer.
Just to follow up too, I think the way we're managing this right now from a consumer standpoint is that you select your preferences. And so based off of your driving style, then you can actually set the preferences in the vehicle, whether you want to be a little bit more aggressive or conservative. And so I would imagine that we do the same thing as we get into inner city driving.
Sure.
I would also note that this is an area where connectivity becomes critically important. The fully human driving cars of 2018, 2019 have remarkable amounts of technology already integrated into them to have potential for vehicle-to-vehicle, vehicle-to-infrastructure communication. Even if the individual even if the human and the robot aren't making eye contact at the intersection, the vehicles have the ability to communicate and to some degree relay information back and forth to one another about precedent.
All right, so this next one is from an electric vehicle owner in Pittsburgh, and they're interested in electric vehicle charging infrastructure that's public facing. And so maybe, whoever would like to address this, Sarah or Alex or Tiara, what is being done to roll out additional public charging in Pittsburgh?
So when I was talking earlier, I mentioned about how we're looking at 6% of new vehicles being sold will be electric by 2025. That's 5-6 years away. That equates to roughly about 35,000 electric vehicles total in the Pittsburgh region fleet. So if you take those numbers and you plug them into NREL's EVI Pro Light tool, it can give us how many charging stations we need. Now, this is a model, this is an estimate. What it looks like is we're going to need about 600 level 2 charging station plugs for public, and we're going to need about 800 level 2 plugs for workplaces. Today, we have 220. So, and that's 220 public. We have I don't know what the number is for workplace because that's private information often. So clearly, we have some ground to make up. So there's two key things that are happening here. One, the incentive that I mentioned earlier that Duquesne Light is rolling out in April, actually Monday. So that's one thing that we're doing to try to install more charging infrastructure. Another thing, if you might be familiar with Driving PA Forward, which is Pennsylvania's administration of Volkswagen settlement funds for the state of Pennsylvania, you can get up to 80% or 100% of charging station costs covered. It's really remarkable depending on the installation. So between those two programs, we're trying very hard to work with our customers who have the ability to deploy more infrastructure to install those charging stations. And I just want to mention that when we think about what the biggest challenge to making that happen is, it's not actually the funding, it's the learning curve. It's the learning curve for a site host to go from a place where no one in that organization, whether it's a multi-unit dwelling, a workplace, or Kennywood, no one at that entity has the job of being in charge of charging stations. So this is a big learning curve that we're working through with our customers to get to the point of yes in saying, I want to be a charging station host and I want to provide these for my tenants, my customers, my visitors, my employees.
I will say it's public charging infrastructure is challenging because it combines all of the fun of a neighborhood conversation about parking with the kind of question of technology risk and managing the appropriate infrastructure. And so one of the real challenges that we have in Pittsburgh is that there is a natural kind of parking crunch in a lot of neighborhoods. We've got residential parking permit programs, in places where home charging kind of doesn't make sense or can't make sense, just given the lack of dedicated infrastructure in the individual's home. I think one of the things that Sarah and I have been grappling with is how we kind of create or even do one of two things: either make it easier for an individual to kind of create curbside infrastructure themselves, or to create kind of collective curbside resources in order to sort of build neighborhood-based charging. It's a real challenge in denser urban areas. My counterparts on the West Coast, number one, they own their power companies, which makes it a little bit easier to be kind of vertically integrated. But two, they have a very different land use and form function. It's definitely a challenge in a dense, compact neighborhood until we'll invent the electric parking chair.
So I was just thinking of a business of an electric parking chair. So let's file and we'll get our VCs together. We'll make it happen. We're winding down here, and I just wanted to kind of give folks a chance to kind of give some last thoughts. But let me set this up, and this will take days to kind of respond to this. But in a previous life I was a transportation engineer, and transportation has really been amazing to society in terms of progress, but it's also been a big source of inequity and displacement and pollution. And so how do we look forward 50 years from now and not regret the choices we're making about transportation, like many of the choices in transportation that were made in previous generations that we're trying to undo now? So Stan, you want to solve that for us in a minute? That'd be great.
You open up a can of worms there. Where we are today, we see a lot of the negative externalities of the vehicle dominated, but we can't forget that what the economic boon that provided to the U.S. and to the average income, and the incredible amount of either quality of life or productivity the automobile has brought. Now we have problems in the cities. I'm optimistic. It's before lunch, and I'm always more awake in the morning. When we look at how we're living, how we're moving forward, how 80% of us are in metropolitan areas, and this is where I appreciate the people on stage. I appreciate interacting with Ford. They are grappling with how do we want to live in the future, and what is the mobility solution. And as long as we're focused on that, and not just the linear thinking of, how do we, I feel our ideas of automated vehicles are just a linear projection of what we've been used to for decades. And that's where Nokia's flip phone was the instantiation of that for phones, and now we have smartphones. There's going to be things on the horizon that totally change our paradigm thought, just like Uber and Lyft has. We used to call it hitchhiking, now we call it Uber and Lyft, and it's totally different.
Carly or Tiara, you have something that you want to jump in on?
I will say that Stan is right, that really it's going to come down to how people want to live and what they value in place. I think that what's exciting to me about all the changes in mobility and the technology and all the new solutions that are becoming available is that we can make more people be able to have access to the sort of denser city-style, Main Street-driven lifestyle, but that's only if people want it. And if there isn't demand, then the private sector will not respond to it.
But I think to that end, it's incumbent on the public sector to not be derelict in its responsibility to recognize that there will be natural market gaps. The historic, the automobile era kind of created displacement, not just because of the technology that the automobiles developed, but because of the investments the public sector made in the interstate highway system. And so I think it's incumbent on us to build, number one, with, not for, and make sure that individual community voices are kind of being lifted up in that conversation, and two, making sure that we're intentional about filling in market gaps by identifying the priorities from day one.
The one thing I would say, actually two things. One, I think collaboration is going to be necessary amongst utilities, cities, OEMs, and so coming together and really solving these problems is really the way that we're going to change the landscape. And then second, I think inspired to think differently. And so imagine a world where you don't have a gas station on every corner, and there is places that are beautiful that you can go and charge. And so we can absolutely change the landscape, which is probably the most exciting thing of all.
We can free up a lot of space that today is dedicated towards storing vehicles, right, inside dense areas or inside destinations where we want to be.
Bringing it home, from an electric utilities perspective, our job is to make sure that everything that we're doing benefits all of our ratepayers. So when we're engaging in transportation electrification in Pittsburgh, in the Pittsburgh region, we have that at top of mind all of the time. So you're going to see that come through in everything that we do here.
Well, it's an exciting time in transportation and e-mobility. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.
So thank you so much, what an insightful panel. Can we get another round of applause for this group?